everyone in Ukraine wants the war to end. They just want it to end on more favorable terms that are currently being discussed. And I think they're looking at this, what's happening now today, with maybe slightly more hope, but I think a fair amount of humor as well. I mean, I'm getting messages from Ukrainians laughing at what some of what they're seeing.
Let's get into what we're starting to learn from this evening and what still remains unclear. And we're fortunate to be able to do so with the chief international correspondent for ABC News, James Longman, who's incredibly familiar with the workings of Trump's White House and has himself reported extensively from inside Ukraine since the start of this war. Hi, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Things are still unfolding. They're in a big multilateral meeting at the moment. We've had a few little press conferences or taking some questions from the press. What would you say? It's hard to tell, isn't it? I would say that everyone looks a little bit nervous and is diplomatically holding the line. Would you agree that's how it's sort of playing out?
I think they're doing their best, aren't they? But it's incredibly awkward. I mean, fundamentally, the Alaska summit was a disaster for Europe, and they're doing their best to try to row back a little bit on what Trump said, first of all, about ceasefires. I mean, he's basically taken the Putin position that there will not be a ceasefire, that there will only be a lasting peace negotiated while the war is happening. And we're looking at these extraordinary pictures of the two men in the Oval Office. I think there's a collage that's been put up of Putin with Trump, and then another two pictures of Trump and Zelensky all together on a wall. There are maps in the Oval Office. I mean, it's very much style over substance, but all this is happening whilst bombs are raining down on Ukraine right now. I think in the last hour or so, there was a ballistic missile attack on Sloviansk. There are drones over multiple cities inside Ukraine. That is no mistake. So I think they're doing their best. I mean, I was interested to see that actually the German chancellor has hinted at this idea, perhaps, that there would be a trilateral meeting. And at the moment that begins, there would then be a ceasefire. So they're all trying to prod a little bit to see what Trump might or might not agree to. Macron has floated this idea of a quadrilateral meeting where the Europeans could be in the room. I think knowing full well that Putin would not want that because he doesn't want smart people around a table making decisions. He wants very much to focus.
He's happy to include Donald Trump then.
Well, I think people who are more likely to be fighting vociferously for Ukraine, let's put it like that.
How do you read the relationship then between Zelensky and Trump? I mean, if we go back not many months to February, that clearly was a frosty relationship. That ridiculous scene in the Oval Office where he was harangued, Zelensky, by Trump and J.D. Vance. So we've obviously moved comparatively quite a lot closer, but Trump is still walking this line of not seeking, wanting to be cordial with Zelensky, but he is not criticising or offering any risk or suggestion that sanctions or any punishment could come Putin's way. He's still sounding very friendly towards Putin.
No, and that's presumably what he promised Vladimir Putin in the room when they were together on Friday. What they're worried about, I think, these European leaders, is that, and it's often said about Donald Trump, that he'll listen to the last person who's in the room with him. And today, the last person in the room with Donald Trump is most likely going to be, yet again, if not in the room, but on the phone, Vladimir Putin, because he says he's going to talk to Putin when he's done with these phone conversations. What happened at that Oval Office meeting, by the way, when there was a blow-up, Donald Trump is understood to have had a very long conversation just before Zelensky came in the room with Steve Bannon, from whom he takes a lot of advice, especially on foreign policy. J.D. Vance as well. These people who are not, first of all, very, very kind of down on Ukraine, but also crucially on Europe. There is I think a view in the White House, and I think at state and across the Trump administration, which is that Europe is just full of these kind of lily-livered wokeristas. And they're not real men, and they're not willing to fight. And that Trump doesn't see himself in any of the European leaders, except perhaps possibly for Emmanuel Macron. It does seem to be an understanding between those two men. And we know that he likes Giorgia Meloni. And that's part of the reason why we've seen, I think she's been trying to be this interloper, if you like, between Europe and Donald Trump. But I think it's this fundamental belief that Europe doesn't have what it takes that is just in the minds, I think, of all the senior members of the Trump administration, which is very hard for them to combat. But that's what they're trying to do right now.
And is that why European leaders have been, almost every single one of them in that press conference, mentioned the idea of the US being part of this security guarantee. Is that their own acknowledgement that they themselves need America to stand there and need to be there? And I guess, and hoping, even if it's just a case of them having to sign checks to Trump, that America, they are extracting from Donald Trump today a greater certainty that he will be there. It's maybe not quite Article 5, but some version of that there is a backstop of US military support.
Yeah, the security guarantees are fascinating, aren't they? Because fundamentally, Donald Trump does not want to be involved in any way other than perhaps in this kind of grandstanding fashion with these press conferences standing alongside European leaders. But just what it is that these security guarantees are that apparently Vladimir Putin has signed up to. I mean, I would just urge a little bit of caution here. We've already heard, I think in the last hour or so, Maria Zakharova, who is the spokesperson for the foreign ministry in Moscow, say that there will not be any security guarantees given to Ukraine, or there should not be, and Russia will not accept those, whether they're NATO, Article 5, or otherwise. And there was a rumor going around, and I should say this is not substantiated reporting, that possibly Steve Witkoff, in his early conversations with the Russians about that Alaska summit, perhaps misunderstood the overtures from the Russian president and didn't realize that he was going to send his principal, Donald Trump, to a meeting with Vladimir Putin, who had not conceded to anything. And that's part of the reason why Donald Trump came out of that. And a Fox News reporter was among those to say that she felt that Donald Trump had been steamrolled in those conversations with Vladimir Putin. So this security guarantee thing, the idea that the Russians have signed up to it, I would like to see what exactly it is that they've said okay to. Do they think that they just need because it's not automatic in some way, that somehow it means less? Because if you water these security guarantees down to such an extent that Russia's prepared to accept them, well, what good are they anyway?
And how much can Ukraine trust these? Because they've had security agreements in the past, whether it was back in 1994, they've been proven since 2014 to not mean anything. And NATO itself has not really seemed to be a case of being able to step in when it's needed.
Well, that's right. I mean, they talk, when you go to Ukraine, they talk again and again about the 1994 agreement, which forced them to give up their nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees. Lo and behold, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. In 2014, they were invaded, and Crimea is now essentially part of Russia. So, look, I think the Europeans are doing what they can to convince Donald Trump that they mean what they say. The agreement on arms shipments, for example, is that the Europeans are basically paying for them. They're sending the US the money. The US gets to make these weapons, and they are shipped to Ukraine. That's a deal that Donald Trump likes. Also, the commitment to increase the percentage of GDP that people are paying on defense. That, again, something that Donald Trump likes. So they're doing what they can. The first issue of security is still very unclear, I would say. And the second issue of territory, that we're nowhere close.
Yeah.
And Marco Rubio himself has said this. They are nowhere close to agreeing that. So this trilateral meeting, Vladimir Putin has said he will not meet Zelensky unless they concede most of the Donbass. I mean, and that is just not going to happen. The Ukrainians are not going to just do that. So where do you go?
And James, I say this, like you've done loads of reporting on the ground in Ukraine. What do you imagine will be their reaction, citizens in Ukraine, as you say, where bombs are still raining down? And is that consistent across Ukraine? Is it different in Kyiv to the east of the country? What will be the Ukrainian reaction?
I think largely they were horrified when they saw what happened on Friday. I've been speaking to people in Ukraine since then, upset at what they know is the Russian media response, which they could see, which was basically celebrating that Friday summit as though somehow Russia had won the World Cup or something. I mean, they were talking about how they'd been, Putin had been accepted into the international fold. The way that Russia talks about Ukraine, I think people have to understand, it is never the top issue. Russia talks about its relationship with the United States, about it being kind of an equal world power, superpower, and Ukraine is kind of not a particularly important issue. They're saying, well, Putin and Trump, they discuss issues of nuclear agreement and world trade, tariffs. He has now been taken seriously by the president of the United States. He's been offered this welcome to Russia. So across Ukraine, horror. Yes, of course, Ukrainians want the war to end. They didn't want it to start. So of course they want it to end. The point is, they understand very, very well that if Russia is given that stronghold, that foothold in the east, they control something like 80% of the Donbass. If they're just given the other 20, which, by the way, it's taken the Russians over a decade to try to get to that 80%, it would take a lot more fighting to get the other 20, then that's just the foothold that Vladimir Putin needs, perhaps to try to invade the rest of the country, to try and take Kherson and Zaporizhia, which we know the other two major provinces that he has his eye on. Zaporizhia, the home of Europe's largest nuclear power plant. I mean, everyone in Ukraine wants the war to end. They just want it to end on more favorable terms that are currently being discussed. And I think they're looking at this, what's happening now today, with maybe slightly more hope, but I think a fair amount of humor as well. I mean, I'm getting messages from Ukrainians laughing at what they're some of what they're seeing. Particularly, I think there was a moment where Donald Trump was looking around the table and he'd forgotten which of the world leaders he was speaking to was the president of Finland.
Yes,
until someone had to remind him.
Yeah. They're not familiar faces, all of them, to him, are they? James, look, thanks so much for your insight. That's really fascinating, and of all your reporting there. That's James Longman, Chief International Correspondent of ABC News. Jenny Mathers now we can turn to, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University and an expert in Russian politics, foreign policy and security. So very much worth speaking to right now. Good evening to you, Jenny.
Good evening.
We understand that there's going to be a call at some point this evening between President Trump and President Putin, presumably for Trump to get some sense of what Putin makes of it. What are your thoughts about what Putin will be thinking as he views the discussions that are happening at the White House?
Well, Putin has been remarkably consistent in expressing his war aims, basically, throughout this conflict. He really wants basically control of Ukraine. He regards Ukraine as just part of Russia, that it doesn't deserve to exist. It's not a real country. It doesn't have a real language or culture, history. And so, he definitely doesn't see the Ukrainians as having any sort of legitimacy as independent existence. And therefore, he's going to push very hard, as he has done, for his own position, which is to get as much territory as possible, either through force or through negotiations, or preferably through persuading the U.S. president to put pressure on Zelensky to see territory that the Russians have failed to take. So, Putin is going to be looking out for his own interests. There are indications that, Putin is certainly not going to accept any sort of security guarantees that would involve NATO member state troops, military forces involved at all. So, the two sides are very far apart still.
James was picking up that point that we should be a little bit suspicious about what this means about the security guarantees, about Putin's agreement to that. So likewise, do you think that the measure of that security guarantee would have to be quite light and a very far away from what anything like a sort of Article 5 NATO type response would be to any Russian incursion?
Yeah, because one of the major motivations really behind this whole war, as far as Russia is concerned, is to eliminate the Western influence in Ukraine, is to stop Ukraine from moving in a Western direction, and to ensure that NATO doesn't get a foothold in Ukraine. Ukraine stays within the Russian sort of orbit, and so the idea that Putin would be agreeable to NATO member states' troops being on the ground is just pretty far from any sort of realistic expectation. So what Putin wants to do is basically roll back NATO, enlargement since the beginning of the 1990s. He wants to go back to the period just before the Cold War ended and say, look, that's where we should start. Russia is entitled to have the sphere of influence, which should encompass basically all of Eastern and Central Europe. So, remove NATO out of that, give us back our entitlements as a great power.
There was a mention by Trump, and it's been backed up this evening by Starmer and other European leaders, that it would be quite a sensible next step to have this trilateral meeting between Zelensky, Putin and Trump. Can you see that happening soon? And will there be any new terms need to be agreed before that could take place?
Well, it's really unlikely that Putin is going to agree to meet with Zelensky unless it is to sign a peace deal, which is very much in Russia's favor. It's highly unlikely that Putin's going to agree to meet Zelensky, because meeting Zelensky face to face would be treating Zelensky as an equal, to Putin and recognizing in a symbolic way that Zelensky is a legitimate leader of another country. And those are things that Putin has really resisted very strongly and spoken against. So I think it's highly unlikely that there's going to be a trilateral relationship or trilateral meeting between the leaders of the US, Russia, and Ukraine anytime soon.
And would that provoke Trump to then say, well, now it's your fault, Putin, for not finding a peace deal? I mean, it seems to be, what is it that's going to frustrate Trump enough to put greater pressure or even sanctions again onto Putin?
Well, past experience suggests that nothing will do that, because what Trump does is he always seems to revert to this baseline default setting, which is, what Putin says is more plausible than anything Zelensky says. Russia's position is totally reasonable. Russia is a great power. It's a big country. It's entitled to take things by force, and everybody else, i.e. Ukraine, should just sort of fall into line. So, Ukraine and its allies work really hard to nudge Trump away from this position and to get him to move even a little bit towards the Ukrainians' position. And then as soon as Trump speaks to Putin on the phone or meets him in person, all of that disappears. So, Trump was saying very strongly, well, Putin's going to have to agree to a ceasefire, or there'll be very serious consequences. And now, there's no talk of serious consequences.
Okay, Jenny, thanks very much. Jenny Mathers, the senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University.